They called him the most dangerous man in England. Though he held no crown and carried no royal blood, Charles Brandon should have been nothing more than a forgotten son of a fallen knight. Yet he became the shadow that walked beside Henry VIII, the man who stole a princess from the grasp of Europe, and the playboy who dared to gamble with the fury of a king. It began with blood on the field of Bosworth, where his father died, protecting Henry Tudor. Out of that death came a strange reward. Young Charles was drawn into the royal court, a boy without rank, yet touched by destiny. He learned quickly that beauty was power and that charm was a weapon. He had both in dangerous measure. With a glance, he could soften the hardest gaze. With a word, he could turn suspicion into admiration. In the tilt yard, where lances shattered like thunder, the boy dazzled the young Prince Henry. The prince saw not a servant, but a reflection of the man he wanted to be. After one brutal contest, Henry grasped Charles by the shoulder and whispered words that would echo through the years. "When I am king, you will not kneel before me. You will stand beside me as my brother." That vow should have been the beginning of loyalty unbroken. Instead, it was the spark of a scandal that would one day shake the crown. For the boy who had nothing would dare to take everything. He would conquer women whispered to be untouchable, and in time, he would claim Mary Tudor herself, the jewel of England, in a union that mocked every law of king and council. This is not a story of quiet loyalty. This is the tale of seduction turned into treason, of friendship twisted into betrayal, of a man who turned desire into a throne of his own making. Stay with us to witness the scandalous rise of Henry VIII's brother-in-law. And subscribe now, for what you are about to hear will strip the Tudors of their final veil. When Charles Brandon entered a room, silence often followed. He did not wear a crown, yet his presence carried the weight of command, his shoulders broad, his stance unshaken, and his eyes gleaming with the confidence of a man who knew the effect he had on others. At the tilt yard, he rode like a storm, breaking lances and leaving his rivals gasping in the mud. At feasts, he laughed with reckless joy, a golden figure who seemed untouchable. And among the women of court, his name passed from lip to lip as both temptation and warning. He lived for risk. Where others hesitated, he rushed forward. He would wager everything on a single throw of the dice or on the smile of a woman promised to another. The danger itself thrilled him, for danger was the fire that kept his heart alive. In tournaments, he would face opponents known for cruelty. In the hunt, he would pursue beasts until his horse trembled beneath him. And every time he returned unscathed, admiration deepened. People began to whisper that fate itself bent around him, that he could not fall. Henry VIII adored this daring spirit. To the young king, Brandon was more than a friend. He was the living emblem of Tudor glory. Watching him shine in the lists and in the halls, Henry felt proud, as though Brandon's victories were his own. He spoke of him not as a servant, but as a brother of the soul, and Charles, with his easy smile, played the role to perfection. Yet behind the smile lived a hunger that no triumph could satisfy. He tasted victory. He tasted admiration. But what he wanted was something greater, something forbidden. In quiet moments, when music faded and torches dimmed, his gaze often lingered on the highest prizes of court life. Women of noble blood, jewels of dynastic power, even the treasures guarded by the king himself. He knew no boundary too sacred to touch. For now he basked in glory, the most dazzling man in Henry's England, but a man who lives by risk cannot resist the greatest gamble of all, and soon the court would learn that the dangerous light surrounding Charles Brandon was not only a reflection of the crown, but a flame that threatened to consume it. Charles Brandon never mistook love for sentiment. To him, it was a currency to be spent, a weapon to be sharpened, a stairway to climb. He had beauty, he had daring, but he knew those gifts alone would not secure the power he craved. What he lacked by birth, he intended to steal by marriage. His first match was with Margaret Neville, a woman whose family ties promised him a foothold among the nobility. But vows spoken in candlelight were no more binding to Brandon than a pledge on the battlefield. When the match no longer served his ambition, he let it wither like a flower denied water. There was no mourning in his eyes, only calculation. It was Anne Brown who revealed the full measure of his ruthlessness. She gave herself to him, bore him children, believed that the man who whispered promises would one day honor them. Instead, she became a shadow, a reminder of a bond that Brandon had no intention of keeping. The court gossiped, the scandal grew, yet he walked through the storm with a smile that dared anyone to confront him. Whispers trailed after him in corridors lit by torchlight. They called him a seducer, a betrayer, a man who touched women not for love, but for what they carried in dowries and family names. Still, the very whispers fed his legend. For some women, the danger was the allure. To be desired by Brandon was to step into fire, and many chose to burn. One evening, in a chamber abandoned to silence, a woman he had cast aside spoke words that would haunt the memory of his name. Her voice trembled with anger and sorrow as she said, "You do not love women. You love the throne they carry on their backs." Those words cut to the truth of him. Brandon was not hunting affection. He was hunting crowns. Each affair, each marriage, was a rehearsal for a greater conquest. He had already proven that scandal could not destroy him. Each time he broke a vow, Henry forgave. Each time he abandoned a woman, the court whispered but still admired. It was as though fate had chosen him to be untouchable. Yet even in his triumphs, there was an emptiness, a hunger unfulfilled. His eyes began to wander beyond the halls of the court, beyond the noble families who could offer him wealth and land. He looked higher, to the rarest prize of all. For if marriage was a ladder, the next step would not simply raise him, it would set him against the crown itself. Every scandal behind him was a lesson, every broken vow a preparation. He had learned that risk was his ally, that danger was his stage, that women could be the keys to kingdoms. Now his gaze rested on Mary Tudor, the princess whose hand could alter the map of Europe. She was the forbidden jewel, the one woman he was never meant to touch. And in that impossibility, Brandon saw his destiny. Mary Tudor was no ordinary woman. She had been given to France as a jewel of alliance, a bride who carried the weight of England on her shoulders. For a few short months, she wore the crown of France, her beauty praised as one of the wonders of Europe. When Louis XII died, she was left a widow at 18, a prize on the board of kings, a living treasure to be bartered again. It was in this fragile moment that Charles Brandon stepped forward. He was sent to escort her back to England, an errand of trust given by Henry himself. The king believed his sister would return untouched, ready for another marriage that could serve the Tudor dynasty. But Henry had miscalculated. He had sent not a loyal servant, but the most dangerous playboy of his court, a man who thrived where desire and risk entwined. In the chambers of the French court, beneath the veils of mourning. Brandon did what no prince dared. He spoke to Mary not as a widow or a princess, but as a woman. He told her of the years they had known each other, the glances exchanged when protocol forbade it, the silence that hid what words could not. She had resisted kings, but she could not resist him. For in Brandon she saw not politics but fire, not duty but desire. The night they chose each other was a night that rewrote destiny. No council blessed it. No crown approved it. They wed in secret, knowing that discovery meant ruin, knowing that Henry's wrath would be swift, yet they chose it all the same. It was the boldest theft of royal blood in Tudor history. Brandon had stolen not gold, not land, but the sister of a king. In the quiet after vows were spoken, Mary pressed her lips close to his ear and whispered the words that bound them forever. I am a princess. I am a queen. But with you, I am only a woman who loves. Those words were sweeter than any cheer from the lists, more intoxicating than any banquet applause. In that moment, Charles Brandon reached the height of his art. He had conquered the unconquerable, turned the jewel of Europe into his wife, and dared to place his life on the edge of a blade. For Henry's love of his sister was fierce, and his pride sharper still. To defy the king was to gamble with death itself. Yet Brandon had always lived for danger, and now he lived within it completely. The world would soon know of their secret, and the court would gasp in disbelief. But for Brandon, the risk was the triumph. He had taken what no man was meant to touch. He had turned scandal into destiny. The bond that began in France would shake the throne of England, for Henry would soon face the betrayal of his closest companion. The brother he had once chosen was now the thief of his blood, and the game Charles Brandon had played so recklessly had become a dance with the executioner's shadow. The news reached London like a spark thrown into dry straw. Courtiers whispered in corners, envoys sent hurried notes across Europe, and the Council of England gathered with faces pale in disbelief. The sister of the king, the jewel meant to bind alliances, had married in secret, and worse still, her husband was no foreign prince, no dynastic equal, but Charles Brandon, the very man Henry had trusted above all others. When Henry learned of it, his fury shook the walls of Whitehall. He stormed through his chambers, his voice echoing like thunder. To the counselors who dared approach, he shouted that treason had been done not by an enemy, but by the brother he had chosen for himself. His face burned red, his hands clenched as if already grasping a sword. The council demanded blood. They spoke of betrayal, of the insult to the crown, of the danger of letting such defiance pass. To marry a princess without royal consent was treason by every law of England. The sentence was clear: death, summoned before the king. Brandon knelt, the weight of silence pressing on him. Henry paced like a lion denied its prey. His words came out as a roar. You have stolen the one thing I could never surrender. You have taken the blood of the king himself. Every man in that chamber thought the Duke of Suffolk's life was measured in hours. They imagined the axe waiting on Tower Hill, the fall of a head that had once worn the laurels of victory. The council pressed Henry to strike quickly, to show the world that no one, not even his dearest friend, could mock the crown and live. But then Mary entered the hall. She stood before her brother, not as a princess or a queen, but as a woman ready to risk everything. She begged him to see that the marriage had been born of love, not ambition. She reminded him of their childhood, of promises made between siblings before the crown had come between them. Her tears fell not only on the floor, but upon Henry's heart. And in that moment, the king faltered. Henry looked at Brandon, and memory fought with rage. He remembered nights of laughter, hunts shared, tournaments celebrated. He remembered the brotherhood he himself had spoken into existence. To kill Charles was to sever his own past, yet to spare him was to show the world that even a king could be defied. The council seethed with outrage when Henry stayed his hand. Brandon was fined heavily, his fortune nearly broken, but his life was spared. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. To the nobles it was weakness. To Henry it was torment. To Brandon it was proof that he had danced on the edge of the blade and survived. As he left the chamber alive, his head still on his shoulders, the courtiers stared in silence, some in awe, some in envy, others in hatred, for they knew that few men could walk so close to death and return untouched. Charles Brandon had risked everything, and fate had bent once more in his favor. Yet survival carried a price. He had betrayed a king and been forgiven. He had married a princess and kept his life, but he had also chained himself forever to suspicion. From this moment onward, every smile, every triumph, every whisper of his name would carry the memory of that betrayal. He had won the greatest gamble of his life, but the dice would never stop rolling. The storm of scandal gave way to an unexpected calm. Against every prediction, Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor began their life together, not in disgrace but in a fragile harmony. The court that had expected their union to collapse watched instead as two people lived in a devotion rare for their age. For the first time, Brandon was not chasing advantage or weaving plots. He was simply a husband, and she was simply a wife. In the halls of their household, laughter replaced whispers. Mary, who had been passed like a token from throne to throne, finally tasted freedom. With Brandon, she could set aside the mask of politics. She read with him by firelight, walked gardens without guards pressing close, and shared quiet meals where the only weight was the warmth of his presence. The man once known as a reckless seducer seemed to have been transformed. His eyes, which had always scanned for the next conquest, rested on her alone. To the courtiers, it was a strange sight. They had seen Brandon abandon wives, cast aside promises, and dance with scandal. Now they saw him loyal to one woman. They whispered that perhaps love had conquered even the most dangerous playboy of England. In tournaments, he still rode with fire. Yet when victory was his, he looked first for Mary's smile. The world was astonished, and for a brief season, Brandon himself believed he had been remade. Their passion was not a quiet one. They burned for each other with a force that defied gossip. When they were apart, he wrote to her with urgency. When they were together, the court could feel the heat of their closeness. Mary spoke often that she had never known what it meant to be a woman until she chose for herself. And Brandon, who had once treated women as keys to power, held her as though she were not a key but the treasure itself. Yet fate does not grant such joy without cruelty. Mary's health began to falter. The glow that had once lit her beauty dimmed, and shadows gathered in her face. Brandon tried to deny it, riding harder, smiling broader, as if force of will could hold death at bay. But no lance, no horse, no laughter could fight the illness that crept through her body. In the end, she slipped away, leaving him with silence where there had been music. For days he wandered their chambers in disbelief. He touched the empty chair at the table, stared at the bed where she once lay, and felt the weight of a loss deeper than any defeat he had known. The man who had risked everything and survived now stood powerless. Love, the one force he could not command, had been taken from him. Her death cut away the one season of purity in his life. With Mary gone, the devotion that had bound him unraveled. He mourned. Yet within that mourning was a strange release. Without her, he was free once more to chase the shadows he had always known. The chain of love had fallen, and the man of scandal stirred again. The court watched with pity and curiosity. They wondered if the faithful husband would remain, or if the old Brandon would rise from the ashes of grief. They did not have to wonder long, for love had been his briefest chapter, and ambition was the book he was born to finish. The years after Mary's death should have left Charles Brandon broken, yet grief never held him for long. He had tasted devotion, and for a brief season he had been transformed. But when love was buried with her, the old man of calculation returned. He looked again at marriage not as a bond of the heart, but as a ladder of power. And soon his eyes settled on a prize that stunned the court. Catherine Willoughby was young, beautiful, and one of the richest heiresses in England. She was nearly the same age as Brandon's own daughter, and her hand had once been intended for his son. Instead, in a move that made even hardened nobles whisper in disbelief, Brandon took her for himself. The wedding was less a union of souls than a coronation of ambition. With Catherine came immense estates and the wealth that secured his dominance until his final breath. The court gasped, yet none could claim surprise. This was the Brandon they had always known, a man who turned scandal into survival and desire into a weapon. Feasts were held in glittering halls where torches shone on gold plate and polished stone. But behind the music there lingered unease. The guests watched Catherine, radiant yet almost childlike beside her aging husband, and they watched Brandon smile with the confidence of a man who had once stolen a princess and now stole an heiress. In whispers, the courtiers spoke of him as a predator of opportunity, a man who had never respected the boundaries of blood or age. Yet the same whispers carried awe, for he had survived trials that should have ended him and had transformed disgrace into glory time after time. To many, he was proof that charm could defy law, and that daring could write its own destiny. His final years were wrapped in comfort. He rode through his lands with the arrogance of a king, attended councils with the authority of one who had been forgiven too often to fear reprisal. Yet beneath the wealth and titles lay a legacy written not in stone but in rumor. To the common people, he was a figure of fascination, the playboy who rose to the highest ranks without a drop of royal blood. To his rivals, he was a reminder of how dangerous beauty and courage could be when married to shameless ambition. At his funeral, one old courtier sighed and gave words to the legend. He was not a prince, but he lived as if crowned. He lived by betrayal, by desire, by a courage that feared nothing. Those words lingered long after the procession ended, for they captured the truth of Charles Brandon. He had been no rightful heir, no chosen ruler. Yet he had moved through life as though the crown hovered above him, invisible but real. History did not remember him for battles won or laws written. It remembered him for daring to steal what others dared not touch, for seducing hearts that carried kingdoms in their veins, for laughing at the edge of ruin and walking away alive. His story is not one of honor but of audacity, not of loyalty but of betrayal cloaked in charm. And so his name remains in the dark corners of Tudor memory, a warning and a fascination. He was the man who lived without limits, who loved as if love were a game, who risked as if death could never reach him. His triumph was his scandal, and his downfall was the shadow of his own legend. Stay with us, for this is only one tale among many. Subscribe and return, as we reveal more of those who turned love into a weapon and carved their names into the darkness of the Tudor throne.